Hi, Kristen Atchison here, and we're starting our conversation about social psychology. In this first video, we're going to talk about kind of our introduction to social psychology, what is social psychology, and just some of the historical research that kind of got us started and got us going, got us thinking about these things socially. And then we'll move into social cognition, the way our relationships make us think differently, how our presence in a kind of social group, these social ideas kind of make us think. So let's get started. So first of all, social psychology is the study of how people think about, influence, and relate to other people. And so this is true both in real life settings and experimental settings. So in the class, we'll talk about both. We'll talk about real life settings and how that can affect how we think, how we behave. We'll talk about some examples that came out of real life settings that inspired experimental settings. And we'll also talk about some experimental settings that kind of try to emulate real life. And so we see these kinds of thoughts and influences and relationships. We see them playing out in both real life and experimental settings. Social psychologists obviously want to use the scientific method as much as possible. So they will engage in those experimental settings so that they can manipulate a variable and then look at the effect. So we remember experimental settings are the only way we can look at cause and effect relationships. So while real life is going to be hugely important in social psychology, we need to be able to have that experimental piece of it so that we can really look at cause and effect. So the one that we're going to talk about today is social cognition. We're going to talk about attributions. We're going to talk about attitudes. We're going to talk about our thinking in relation to these things. In class, the next class online that we'll talk about social behavior. That includes pro-social behavior such as altruism and egoism, but we'll also talk about aggression too. And then in class, we will talk about social influence. We'll talk about group influence and prejudice in class, and we'll have time for a class discussion. And then online, we will finish up social influence with conformity and obedience. So let's kind of start out with an example of something that was both happened in real life and then moved into experimental settings in social psychology, just to kind of set the stage on how we think about this. And your chapter really starts here. So if it seems like, well, why are we just starting kind of with this one example? This is kind of how your chapter starts. So to continue that progression of their discussion, I included it at the beginning as well. So there was a woman named Kitty Genovese, and she was brutally murdered in an alleyway. Now, this alleyway had tons, and this is in New York City, had tons of apartment windows facing the alley. And I believe it was a really nice day, so the windows were open. So there was lots of opportunity to hear or see what was going on. She was brutally murdered, like I believe in the 20s of stabs, okay? So, I mean, this is not like just a quick, murder and then I'm out. This was brutal, screaming, yelling. This should have been very well heard. So the question then was, why did no one help her? There's hundreds of apartments, maybe not hundreds, but tons of apartments facing her, facing this crime scene, facing this murder. There was plenty of opportunity for people to intervene, and yet nobody did. So the researchers wanted to know why. Why did nobody come to her aid? And they found that before helping, we must first notice the incident. Then we have to interpret it as a situation that needs help, that as an emergency, as someone that is needing of help. And then we have to feel responsible for it. And we'll talk about why the researchers say that nobody felt responsible for this incident. And it's what we call the diffusion of responsibility. So they're studying what's called bystander intervention. So again, this is that idea that you have to notice the incident, you have to interpret it as such, and you have to feel responsible. So if you notice the incident and you interpret it as you notice the incident, yes, then you go to the next question. Do you interpret it as an emergency? If you don't notice the incident, and I'm sure there was people in some of those apartments that didn't notice the incident, there's always the people that have selectively attention somewhere else, and so they're missing things. There's obvious some people are just a little bit more oblivious than others. There was definitely people that didn't notice the incident. And so if you don't notice the incident, you're not going to be able to help, right? So we go to the next question. Do you interpret the incident as an emergency? If you interpreted the incident as emergency, you go to the next piece. Are you going to assume responsibility? If you don't interpret the incident as an emergency, there's going to be no help. So in the assume responsibilities, if you assume responsibility for the situation, you're going to be likely to help. If you don't assume responsibility, you're not going to be able to help. And so what the researchers said here is that any one of these places, somebody could have fallen out of the willingness to help. And part of the problem in this situation is there were so many windows facing it. There were so many people. This was a very, very kind of public place, as much as an alleyway can be public. And so what they think happened is this bystander effect, this diffusion of responsibility, that the tendency of any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if there are other bystanders present. We'll kind of talk about this a little bit when we get into kind of conformity as well, that we tend to behave the way other people are behaving socially. Also, if there are more people, you're less likely to help. So if you pass an accident that just happened on a busy highway, it's really easy to go, oh, well, someone else will call the police. Oh, someone else will stop and help. I don't have to do that because there's that, so many people have seen it, there's that diffusion of responsibility. Whereas if you pass an accident on a really isolated road or in a really, place that there's not a lot of people, you're going to be more likely to stop and see if those people need aid because there's not likely to be somebody else that's going to come and give them aid. So this diffusion of responsibility is that the fewer people help when others seem available. So here on the graph, we have the percentage attempting to help. And so you can see we have about 85% people attempt to help when there are no other people there available to help. Once we get to just one other person available there to help, we get down to about a 60% attempt to help. 2 people, we're down to 50%. 3 people, we're down to 40%. 4 people, we're down to 30%. And so you can see how in a really public, in a setting that there's a lot of people that are witnessing this, that diffusion of responsibility kind of goes down. And so this is, again, a really good intro into talking about social psychology because there's a lot of different things going on here. We'll talk about the social behavior part of it. We'll talk about that altruism, who's willing to help, why are they willing to help. We'll talk about kind of the social cognition, the thought process in going into making decisions. We'll talk about the effect of other people, the group, right? And so this is saying the bigger the group, the less likely we are to help. And that's going to be kind of a factor of conformity and obedience as well. So we'll talk about all of those. And so this is kind of our one of our social psychology examples that kind of has all of those things at play. And remember, just like anything in psychology, we can face kind of what developmental psychologists call the Humpty Dumpty problem, which is that we break everything down into such little pieces. How do we put it back together? And again, this example is one that has a lot of different facets of social psychology all in one situation and in one example. Okay. So let's start talking about social cognition. The first thing that we're going to talk about is people perception. So social cognition is all about how do people select, interpret, remember, and use social information. And the first way that we can do this is how we perceive other people. There's lots of different research about how first impressions will change our perceptions of people. We also know a lot of research about physical attractiveness. Even actually in the realm of more cognitive psychology, or more cognitive science, there's a lot of information on face processing. And this idea that beautiful is good, this stereotype that beautiful is good, really comes out of our propensity to process faces, and how we process faces. So remember, I told you that we have an area in our brain that is exclusively processing faces. It's called the fusiform face area. And we know that several things about how we in general process faces, what we consider attractive. One of the things that we consider really attractive is symmetrical faces. So this would be a lateral symmetry, so that the left side of the face is symmetrical to the right side of the face. We see faces that are more symmetrical as more attractive. We also see that composite faces are really, really attractive, and that's what you have here in this image. We have basically where these faces have been kind of averaged together. They took different faces and they kind of averaged them together, and what you'll see is that face in the middle that is more ambiguous in terms of race, that is more ambiguous in terms of gender, that is more ambiguous in terms of all of these things, but it's going to be highly, highly symmetrical, is going to be seen as more attractive than some of the faces that are further out on that circle. We also see youthfulness as more attractive than older faces. And again, this will be also one of those artifacts of that we perceive average faces, these composite faces as more attractive. This is also something we see in infants. Infants prefer attractive faces. Infants prefer more average faces. So this is something that's not necessarily learned. This is something that has to do with how our brains process faces. Another part of person perception is stereotypes. I presume that you're all very familiar about what a stereotype is, but stereotypes can be really harmful, especially when they create these self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is in a situation that we act in a way that will fulfill the social expectations of us. So because we know a stereotype, we may behave in a way that fulfills that stereotype, even if it's something that we're not comfortable with that stereotype. Sometimes we will still behave in that way to kind of fulfill those social expectations based on whatever the stereotype is, whether that's gender or ethnicity or religion or any of the numerous things that we can stereotype people on because we're humans. Again, the self-fulfilling prophecy is that we act in a way that fulfills that. And this can be really, really extra harmful in a situation like stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is where because we fear being judged by a stereotype, so say there's a stereotype that you don't like, it can actually change your behavior and actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we'll see in studies on gender and ethnicity when stereotypes are activated. So a stereotype again on, we've talked about that women aren't as good at math than men are. If that stereotype's been activated before a math test, women typically perform worse and men typically perform better. So this stereotype threat is it actually kind of hinders the person that has that stereotype. They're so worried that they're going to be judged based on that stereotype that they actually perform worse than if that stereotype hadn't been activated. They also do that in the studies across racial and ethnic groups. And so there's, again, stereotypes that say that different ethnicities don't perform as well academically as other ethnicities. And what we see is when we give them, we'll do two conditions then, research will do two conditions, and one group they'll say, this is not a test, and the other group they'll say, this is a test of your academic abilities. And just the difference of telling you about the test is the exact same. Those who are in a racial or ethnic group that are stereotyped as performing worse, perform worse. And those who are in, when we've been told it's a test of academic abilities. And those who are told that have a positive stereotype perform better. And we see this big group separate between those two performances. Now, when you look at those same two racial and ethnic groups, and you tell them this is not a test, there's no difference in performance. So again, this shows us that these stereotypes can actually cause us to perform in ways that match them through these self-fulfilling prophecies and stereotype threat. Another thing we're going to talk about in social cognition is the attribution theory. Attribution theory is how we explain our own or others' behavior and how we credit that behavior. So we can either credit it to a situation or an external attribution. So something about the external, something outside of me, something about the situation caused me to behave this way. Or caused someone to behave this way. So you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts you off. If you gave that an external or situational attribution, oh, I bet they were late for work, and so they just, were in a hurry. That would be a situational or an external attribution. It's something outside of them that caused them to behave that way. Where a personal or a dispositional or an internal attribution would be something about that person, these enduring personality traits. So that person cut me off because they're just a jerk. That would be an internal or a dispositional attribution. And so this attribution theory says that we attribute our own behavior and other people's behaviors either to these external situational attributions or to these internal personal distributions. And when we can make these attributions, we can mess up these attributions. And so Ross discussed the fundamental attribution error. And this is when trying to understand the cause of someone's current behavior, we tend to overestimate the influence of these personal internal attributions for someone else. And we tend to underestimate the influence of the situation, the external attributions. When I gave you the example of driving down the highway and someone cuts in front of you, and I said, oh, maybe they're just late for work and that's why they cut me off. It has nothing to do with who they are. Some of you are probably rolling your eyes, and that's because you are engaging in the fundamental attribution error. We're more likely to overestimate the influence of these personal internal attributions, this person's just a jerk, than we are to say it's something about the situation or an external attribution, to underestimate that influence. For a research example, there was a study done at Williams College where students assumed a person's friendly behavior was a function of the person's disposition, these internal values. And they even believed that after they were told that the participant was, that this person was paid to act that way. So even after they said, okay, yeah, but we actually gave them this external situational thing that changed their behavior. The students, the researchers, the research participants were like, oh, no. Yeah, you might have paid them, but they were still just really nice people. They just happened to be getting paid on top of it. They would have acted that way anyways. So this is, again, overestimating that influence, that personal or these internal attributions. And that can be both the good, as this research example gives you, or the bad, like our traffic example gives you. So that fundamental attribution error is that we're going to overestimate those personal internal attributions, and we're going to underestimate the influence of the situation for other people. Now, is that going to be the same when we're talking about our own behavior? The answer is no. We tend to explain our own behavior in terms of external causes. You're not going to say, I cut somebody off in traffic because I'm a jerk, right? That's rarely what you're going to say. We tend to take credit for our successes and deny any responsibilities for failure. So we have this self-serving bias that we're more likely to take credit for our successes and deny our responsibilities for failures. This means that we overestimate the influence of personal traits in the behaviors of others, like we saw in that fundamental attribution error. And yet, when we explain our own behavior, especially our failures or problematic actions, we overestimate the influence of the situation. So, example, if I'm yelling at my kid, I'm going to say, if she's yelling at me, that she's got an anger problem, she's being disrespectful, you're going to get grounded, you can't do that, we don't talk to people that way. However, when I yell, it's because no one in this house listens to me, and unless I use a voice like this, you just ignore me, right? Doesn't that sound like a parenting thing to say? But this is an example of that self-serving bias. This is an example of that actor-observer effect, that we're going to have different perceptions of these attributions when they're about ourselves than we are when they're about somebody else. The next thing that we're going to talk about is attitudes. Attitudes are beliefs about people, places, and ideas. So we can have an attitude. So say Jill has a negative attitude towards a particular fast food restaurant. This attitude can have different components to it. It can have a cognitive component, like our beliefs and our thoughts and our ideas about that object. It can have an emotional component, our feelings and emotions about the attitude, and it can have a behavioral component, how we're going to act on that thing. So attitudes really have these our beliefs about people, places, and ideas, but they can have different components about how we express them. One of the ways that attitudes play out is in cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this psychological discomfort we feel when our attitudes and our actions conflict. So back to this previous slide, If it will work for me. Oh, goodness. Sorry, guys. Okay, well, it's not going to work. So back to that previous slide, that behavioral component, our attitude, our cognitive component says one thing, and our behavioral component says another thing. And those two attitudes don't mix, and that makes us feel bad. Okay, that makes us feel uncomfortable. So I think one thing, I'm behaving another way, I'm behaving one way, and I think something else, that feels uncomfortable. And so we have what we call cognitive dissonance. And our resolution is that we can either change our attitude or we can change our behavior so that they do match. So an example would be, I said that I liked the task, whatever the task was, but I really didn't like the task. Okay, so that feels uncomfortable, right? Like I've said one thing, so that's a behavior, but I actually think something else completely. That cognitive component is different. And that mismatch feels uncomfortable. So one way we can resolve this, one solution, is we can change how we think about the task. So I said I liked the task, that my behavior said I liked the task. So you know what? I really did like the task. It really was okay. And we can kind of rationalize it to ourselves that it felt okay, that we can change our cognition about it. To really further push that, we can sometimes even add a justifying cognition. So I said I liked the task, but I didn't really like the task, but they paid me to do the task and I liked that part of it. So overall, I liked the task because they paid me to do it. That justifying cognition would be another way to change our thoughts. So both in these situations, we're changing our cognition to match our behavior. So another example would be if we believe that recycling is a good thing, but we didn't put the recycled can in the recycle, we put it in the trash. So then we have that behavior and that cognition not meshing, right? So in this situation, the way we're going to do it is we're going to change our behavior. I believe recycling is a good thing. So maybe I'm going to grab that real quick out of the trash can and put it in the recycle. So we're changing our behavior to match our cognition. So then once again, those are equal. And so that cognitive dissonance is reduced. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is self-perception theory. So self-perception theory is that individuals make inferences about their own attitudes by perceiving their behavior, especially if their attitudes are unclear. So if we're not really sure what we think our attitude is, how we believe what we think about something, what our attitude is about something, we may infer that based on our behavior. So we might look at how we actually behave and say, okay, well, this is what must be what I believe, this must be what I think, this must be my attitude, because this is how I'm acting that out. So both cognitive dissonance that we just talked about and self-perception theory that we're talking about now really show this connection between attitudes and behavior. So in cognitive dissonance, we're striving to kind of balance that out. We're striving for that consistency. So I hate my job, but I work hard at it. So I really need to fix my attitude, change that cognition so that I have that cognition, that consistency. In self-perception, we're again inferring our attitudes based on our behaviors. I spend all my time thinking about how bad my job is. That is the behavior, right? So I must really hate my job. That's that inference to that attitude based on our behavior. So both of these really show us how our thoughts and our behavior are linked. And again, we're going to talk about social behavior as well. Thanks.